what happened, but that should be fixed now. I just switched to a stronger internet line. Okay, well, I think we'll probably get started, and then we still have some audience members trickling in, but they'll join us as they join. So, hello everyone, and welcome to ArtEvolve for this week. As usual, I am not hello@articheck.com, but I am Mackenzie, CCO at Articheck. And today's topic is fostering female leaders in the art world, which we are very excited to speak about. Now, we've obviously used female leaders as the term because it's International Women's Day earlier this week. But of course, we're kind of talking about a number of marginalized groups across the gender spectrum, right? When we speak about this type of topic, including non-binary people like myself. So I have with me here Claire Hindle, who is the co-director of the World Art Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us, Claire.
Hi, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to have our talk.
Wonderful. Well, Claire, will you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Claire Hindle. I'm currently the director of World Art Foundations. And to start with a bit about my career background, I always been in the art world of sorts. My job was with Sotheby's, and I had the joy of traveling around Europe teaching antique dealers how to use digital camera when I was, I don't know, 24, something like that. And Sotheby's was very much ahead of its time then, thinking that the internet was going to be the future. But then 4 years later, they decided to actually close the department because it wasn't as successful as they thought it was going to be. So the reason why I'm bringing it up is because that's, I suppose, my first role within the art world was a bit bumpy, and being made redundant at an early age influenced me throughout my career. So actually from then I moved into the property world because there was a bit of a boom in London at the time, especially with digital taking off. And I had a job as operations director for datography, where I stayed there for 6 years. I learned an awful lot commercially, and from there I almost burnt out, and I decided that actually I wanted back to the art world, but instead of going I would and I started to apply different have any and actually started raising funds for education. And then I moved on to Gardens, where I was the associate director for major gifts for the Planet campaign, where we had to raise 100 million.
Your internet's actually going in and out a little bit.
Oh no.
Yeah. So I think you're okay. It just, let's see. Yeah, it just started to pause a little bit. So just could you just repeat the last thing you said?
I was just saying that I spent some time at Kew Gardens, where I was the major gifts associate director, and I was on the. It was amazing. It was revolutionary for me because I was working on a big team. We had to raise 100 million in 5 years. We had David Attenborough as our lead, so I got him, which was mind blowing.
That's pretty incredible.
And it was, and that's where I first really cut my teeth with high net worth individuals, and it is a completely different world, and one that through fundraising I've managed to sort of get my head around, for want of a better word. And from there I was headhunted for Cass Sculpture Foundation, which is an art organisation down on the south coast here in England, and I was the executive director there for 6.5 years. I was directed by two founders who were in their late 80s and 90s, and we had a very influential board of male 60s plus amazing people, and that was really when I first experienced how tough it was to be a young female trying to be professional and to grow in that market, which
and
I
as
did.
an executive. Wow.
Yeah. Very challenging, but so rewarding. And then from there, I had the great joy of meeting Helena Stork and Peter Deckers, the founders of World Art Foundations. So I joined there in March 2020. Sorry, that was a bit of a long spiel, but just to give you
No,
some
that I
background.
think it was important to kind of establish your experience as a woman leader in the art world. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just so that like our listeners kind of know what direction I'm coming at this from, right? So I was in the academic art world and then went into business and marketing and mostly technology startups. And from there moved into ArtEcheck. And so ArtEcheck is sort of my first leadership role in the art world, not my first leadership role overall, because I've had leadership roles in technology and startups. And I think it's very interesting to kind of look at the parallels as well between the industries that you see. And sometimes things are very different, and sometimes things are very much the same. So I think it's been quite an experience for me because I actually joined a female-led company, right? So ArtEcheck's founder is our CEO, Annika Eriksson, and so kind of coming into that environment, being in the art world, and then kind of being able to join and now grow up into being a co-founder has been a pretty amazing experience. And I really love being in this space. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm coming from on the topic. So why don't we have you quickly tell us a little bit about the World Art Foundations, and then we'll go into talking about fostering female leaders.
Yeah, of course, that's great. World Art Foundations was founded, as I say, by Helena Stork and Peter Deckers back in 2014. It's a membership organisation for art foundations around the world. And an art foundation is a privately funded art organisation which has an active public programme. They may or may not have a collection, and they have charitable status, and they could be founded by a couple or an individual or a corporate or an artist or a collection of artists. And they're all unique, but they have many, many different commonalities between them. They are very, very different to the public institution. And as I said earlier, I really learned a lot at Cash Sculpture Foundation. And I felt at the time very isolated because all of the public institutions have many, many networks in all the different regions around the world, pulling them all together. Whereas if you're in a private institution, you're very much alone and you're delivering the legacy of your founders, whoever they may be. And I really felt that actually by joining Helena and Peter, this would be a great opportunity to set up a network. And as I said earlier, I started on March of 2020. So just as COVID hit, we launched our program, and it was very much a silver lining because everybody was.
So was WAF that young?
Well, it founded in 2014, but we didn't start our active program, our membership program, until 2020. And so,
wow, we've had I'm amazed that we've been able to achieve in that amount of time.
I know. Well, that's really testament to a lot of hard work by myself and Helena and Peter and Nina, and I think ultimately the need for connecting and sharing and learning from one another. I'm delighted to say that, everyone is extremely excited by the program. It's amazing
that's come out of the pandemic. I think a lot of really interesting things have come out of the pandemic. And I think something else also that's come out of the pandemic is also the effect kind of the way that our society is set up on female leaders, right? So just to throw some stats out there to start our conversation, women spend between 2 and 10 more hours a day than men caring for children, caring for family, caring for the disabled or the sick in their family. And they also earn an average of 60 to 75% compared to men's wages, right? So I think the pandemic has sort of brought this out a little bit more, right? Because of also the lack of childcare and things like that have been available. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity because there is that ability to be more flexible. That
Yeah,
wasn't the case before when there was really like office or bust culture.
yeah,
So
very much so.
yeah.
I was one of the very lucky people that I have two children. They're now 5 and 8. And when I started at Cast Sculpture Foundation, I actually decided to tell them that I was going through IVF because I wanted to be transparent and I didn't want to suddenly start the job and then fall pregnant a month later. And I was literally expecting them to pull the offer off the table, but I'm delighted to say they didn't. So
Great.
a few months later, a wonderful thing happened, and here I am, blessed with two children. But the one thing that really made a transformative difference to my career was that my husband worked at Sotheby's at the time and was able to take on the paternity leave. So for both of the children, I only took 3 months on each. It was incredibly tough. But I was determined to have a career and not to be a housewife. And my husband, has absolutely loved it. And I hope very much that there'll be more opportunities for that for all females in the workplace today.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point that some of the kind of moves that can be made is not necessarily just on lifting women up, but it's also about making sure that men in the workplace have the opportunity to take part in the home life, and they
Definitely.
have those accesses available to them.
Yeah,
So yeah,
definitely. It
yeah.
was, transformative for me for sure.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the female leadership in the context of WAF. So WAF's engaged with a lot of leadership positions. You have obviously your institution, but also you work with dozens and dozens of other institutions who have founders and directors and all sorts of individuals who could be a leader. And so 20 years ago, a lot of these roles, right, if not most, would have been held by men. So what does that picture look like now? So how many women are kind of a part of your active membership, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at, as I should have said earlier, but another specific thing about art foundations is that they're generational. So they go from, theoretically, as long as they're sustainable, they go from generation to generation. And it's so fascinating to see how those organizations develop because, of course, if the founders are no longer here and the family haven't taken on, then you get a situation where a chair or a president of the board is actually running the organization with the executive below. Looking at the stats across our model, it's fascinating because I'm delighted to say that 61% of directors are female. And I think it's wonderful to see. I do think that 20 years ago it wouldn't have been anywhere near that. And I think because you've got to be at a certain wealth in order to establish an art foundation, you're more often than not, you're in the later part of your career. And so therefore, it's going to take a few decades before we see more female founders. But at the moment, if I get this stat right, so we're 16% of our organizations were founded by females. I'm seeing some really exciting new social entrepreneur females who are leading the way with new institutions, which is lovely to see. But 41% of them have been set up by men. And then the other 43% is set up by couples or by individuals. So I do think in the next couple of decades, there will be a shift, one hopes.
Right. Well, and it's also, as some of the foundations that are a little bit more mature, right? I'm sure that those who are actually in charge from the families or from the line of the original founders tend to be, more of a mixed bag now as well.
Yeah. And I think also I've got that stat that I looked at too, because I thought it was really interesting that only 10% of the chairs are female. And again, that's very sort of expected right now. And again, I hope that will grow and change as we go by.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I see Ben has some great questions. I'm going to include those in the Q&A at the end. So if anyone else has any questions for the Q&A, feel free to pop them into the Q&A section or in the chat, and I'll go back over them kind of at the end of our chat.
Great.
So yeah, so that's great. So let's talk a little bit more kind of practically about women in the workplace.
Yeah.
You know, those anywhere kind of on the non-men spectrum, let's say, is kind of what they put in socialist circles. And so if we look at that in terms of in the workplace, you know, female leaders, but also those who would like to become leaders in the future, what are some of the challenges that we're kind of looking at right now?
I think there are two. Yeah, there's two things that I wanted to, that were going around my mind. I think over the last 2 years, I think that the greatest challenge is that none of us, specifically to the art world, none of us have been going to networking events. None of us have been going to openings. None of us have had those opportunities to really connect with our peers in a face-to-face existence. And that's such a great tool to learn. And, you know, ultimately, my belief, or I can attribute a lot of my success looking back at my career as to how I built those connections, meeting people. And yeah. I think I feel very sorry for the younger generations that have been stuck through the pandemic. They've missed 2 years of that. And I think it's going to be a challenge to overcome when they come back. When I was at Kew Gardens, for example, as a fundraiser, I got taught how to network the room from a philanthropic point of view. And it takes confidence, it takes experience and practice. And a lot of people, you know, exactly haven't had that. That's one.
Yeah.
Then I was also thinking about some of the text that has been shared recently about potential versus outcome. What did we say? Yeah, performance. And I think it's also it's difficult to balance between the two. And I think for me personally, the one benefit was to have a mentor. I was very lucky to have a female senior mentor when I was at CAS, and it was a game changer. And I think that's something that I would encourage every female senior, you know, whatever level, middle, to find a mentor who can give you that sound advice and confidence and exposure to new things.
Yeah, well, and then it's more and more possible, right? Because I think for a certain generation, even perhaps a little bit like before yours, Claire, there weren't any choices, right? There was no one above them to be able to have that opportunity. But I think that now that there is that opportunity more available, maybe not as available as we'd like, but it's more pervasive, you know, should take advantage of it as much as possible.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's something I really loved about coming into ArtEcheck, right? Was to have access to Hanika, which was great.
Yeah. You learn so much from each other, don't you? And I think that I see it in art foundations. You know, they're all so much more, what's the right way of describing it? Forward thinking in terms of changing the model and reviewing and reflecting how to improve processes and practices so that people have more opportunities and always striving to be better. Yeah.
So I think, you know, one of the ones that we're talking about in the chat just at the beginning was the gender pay gap and that bot that came up on Twitter, right? So this is still obviously something that comes up, and apparently this particular bot, whenever any business or public body organization mentioned International Women's Day, it would then sift through the public salary data like it was an algorithm, right? It would sift through the public salary data and then post the results, which I found to be savage, but a very effective method of showing performative activism.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's scary to think that, but I think it's great that it's the light is shone on those horrendous pay gaps. Of course, nobody thinks that it's the right thing. It's difficult for it to, I think people always have to have the confidence to show what they are or show what they've achieved.
Yeah.
what I was saying earlier about the potential versus the performance.
Right. Well, I think we often also think about, we think about the pay gap and we're like, that's too, that's too bad. That's not helpful. That's not good. But we don't really know exactly what to do about it besides, okay, make it equal. But what does that mean exactly, right? And I think particularly in the art world, where sometimes, especially if you're looking at certain, in each industry, I would say that there's a particular role that tends to be much more like women heavy in terms of hires, right? So, for example, I went to like a conservators conference in in Sweden, and it was mostly women, right,
Yeah.
that were there at that particular event, which was amazing. But what that means is that potentially, if there was a pay gap 10 years ago, and they're hiring people based on those wages, then there's still going to be a pay gap now, right?
Yeah.
When you look at
Yeah.
that type of information. So I think, when we're having these conversations, there's sort of a lot more to consider versus, beyond just that's bad, let's fix it.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, talking from an art foundation point of view, all of the organizations are so unique and different. You can't say one director has a level compared to another. They are always so unique. I did like when I was at Kew Gardens, because it was a public body, all of the pay grades were transparent. Everybody knew what everyone was on. And if you were in band X, Y, and Z, that's where you were at. And having experienced it firsthand, I think that linked with a robust appraisal system, I think is really the only professional way to move forward.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, and beyond that too, you're kind of thinking about, like you were mentioning how your job at the foundation, you let them know that you would be, at some point probably bringing a child into the world.
Yeah.
And they were okay with it, right? But I know there's so many circumstances where sometimes that's not the case, or someone comes back from maternity leave and is sort of, penalized for it.
Yeah,
So,
most definitely. Yeah. And I think I had one funny story, and I think it's sort of because I didn't get paid whilst I was on maternity leave. So in that financial year, I obviously earned three months less pay. And then I came back, and one of the trustees thought that I'd got a pay rise and actually said, how, what?
Yeah. Wow, I didn't even realize
think,
that. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a stigma around taking time off work for family. I think that it's going to take a long time for people to achieve a perfect work-life balance. Yeah, I think being open and really pushing for transparency and accountability is the best way to do it. And then at least you can start those conversations.
So Clarence is just bringing up the point that some of the stats that Claire is bringing through from the private point of view. You're right, that is true. I think what we're kind of talking about generally, though, applies across the board. So whether you're in public or private, these workplace kind of concerns exist along with, a number of others. And I think some of the same kind of types of solutions we're going to talk about now also can be applied. It doesn't necessarily differ between sectors. And honestly, even just private, public, right? We're also talking commercial. So we're looking at commercial galleries, you can look at conservation studios, you can look at, right, any of those types of fine art shippers. This applies kind of across the board, I would say. So let's talk a little bit about what are some best practices that can be put into place in terms of helping organizations to support women. And so also, I know we do have some women leadership in the audience today. And so I think this is kind of maybe some helpful feedback for them, but also just anyone who is in a leadership position, right? Or has that power to kind of influence the company culture or the institution's culture. What can we do, So do you have any ideas on that, Claire?
I have many, and I think I'm sounding a little bit like a parrot, but it is transparency, accountability, and also really addressing the unconscious bias and making sure that the whole application process, for one part, is you remove all of those opportunities for bias to creep in. And I think that I've definitely seen a change in the last 5 to 10 years. At least we are talking about it now. And I think we've had a number of calls within our Hub for Art Foundations where, people have openly said they are actively looking for a woman, or they are actively looking for somebody with a specific minority group. And I think that's great to hear. I think that the more proactive we are, the better. And actually, one of the greatest tools I've found is to slow down a bit. As cheesy as it sounds, it's actually, we're all under so much pressure to deliver and to achieve. But it's when you stop and reflect on those standard processes that have been in place for however many years that you actually see perhaps we could do this slightly different to make it more equality, to have better equality.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's just those little shifts. But I think what you were talking about intersectionality, right? So it's not just about women as a single body, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And obviously, we're both white women. So there are issues that we can't speak to necessarily, which, need to be spoken about. But intersectionality in terms of both from the perspective of those with intersecting like marginalizing communities, like for example, I am disabled and on the women spectrum, so those types of things really need to be taken into account, I think. And institutions now, it can't just be about women and men. It has to go beyond that, I think, in order to really be kind of comprehensive in creating an inclusive culture. Right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In terms of tools, it's hard to really, it's such a huge topic. And I think that the other point, not just harping back to mentoring, but is to really to support one another. And one thing that we're really championing at WAF is to share experiences and expertise, because it is only from learning from other people's experiences that a lot of organizations can then have the faith and the tools to then implement. So for example, case studies are so important, especially if you are trying to implement change within an organization. They can be a great tool to help shift the mind of a board. Yeah,
definitely. So why don't we back up a minute and think about, even if we go all the way back to the beginning of someone even thinking about, considering joining the art world for a career. I think there are some blockers there too, especially when you think about like art world jobs that are about prestige, but the pay may be low, right?
Yeah.
So
see,
what can we do in the first place, right, to bring more kind of women, and perhaps women who don't have a family or support network to rely on, right, to join the industry in the first place?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that quite often, I mean, I remember myself coming out of university knowing that I wanted to go into the art world, but not really. I mean, you spend however many years at university, but you don't really know the difference between an auction house or a commercial gallery or an art foundation or even a public gallery. You know that, okay, I'd like to be a conservator, or I'd like to be a curator, or I'd like to be an expert within this particular field. But I think in those first few years when you enter the art world, they're so informative. It's so, it's I think providing opportunities for people so that they can experience a multitude. I think that I've always struggled with the internship model in the sense that I'm 45. So when I first started, I left university, I did not have the means to take on an internship. I couldn't fund myself. And so therefore it was incredibly difficult. And I'm saddened to see that it's still here now. When I was at CAS, I had to argue that the internships were paid. Anyway.
Yeah, no, agreed. And that's something that actually I've done at Artitech is, we've had part-time interns who were paid, obviously not enough to live on if they're doing a part-time internship, but like, being compensated for their input, I think is something that.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it is a role that we've abused for decades, because ultimately nobody really wants to do the grind work, do they? But an intern is a perfect role for doing that entry level work, and I feel strongly that it should be paid. Yeah,
and I think there's some institutions really rely on interns and kind of rely on that level of support that could go to like an assistant or an administration operations person or something like that, and the institution may not be able to actually support that role.
But it would be nice if within the art world, apprenticeships were looked at more. There are so many different models that could work around the world. It doesn't have to be the sort of, everyone strives to get a Peggy Guggenheim internship when they first leave uni. There are little points that I think we could be a bit more broad-minded about.
And then therefore more inclusive, right? Kind of allowing.
Exactly. And it is great to see that there are lots of organizations making that change. So I shouldn't be too negative about it.
No, of course, but I think it is something that, still to keep an eye on, and just to make sure also, I think something that I sometimes see, which surprises me, is also the level of compensation that doesn't necessarily change that much by cost of living wherever that institution is located. So sometimes it'll be, in a big city like New York or London, and the pay level will be quite similar to something that's in a much, more rural, much more kind of lower cost of living area. So
definitely.
That can be difficult, just again, in terms of kind of allowing for that inclusivity and that accessibility. You don't even have the people coming in the door who have those varied experiences and can offer that varied input, because they can't, they can't make that choice.
I actually suffered at CAS. We desperately needed to grow our team, but we were very remote, so it was really hard to get young people to move to a rural area. And
really?
We did.
Oh goodness.
I'm going back a number of years, but there's always two sides to the story, isn't there? And I think that it's. I've lost my thread slightly here, but I was just thinking that it's in order to get more young people into the arts. I love the fact that I'm seeing a lot more teen programs in art foundations. Education's got to be at the heart. It's got to start really, really early. And I think I do see within public institutions, it's either, kindergarten or it's teens. And I think the challenge is getting something in between, and really not only just making sure that they all have a passion for art, but also that they have an understanding of the art world. What is a curator? How is the artwork handled and moved around the world? I would love to see more of that too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think too, obviously the pandemic has kind of helped this in a way, because of the ability to work more remotely, and maybe even work remotely most of the time, and then travel for a few days a month even to be at the institution if it's not located near to where if you're not located so close enough to where you're working, where the institution you're working at. So I think that flexibility, again, like allowing for that flexibility is so valuable.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. It's a two-sided coin, because sometimes I've felt sorry for people that haven't been able to be in the office or in the gallery or in the institution. You miss out a lot of their experiences. I was thinking the other day about how board meetings are so different now. And actually, as a junior, if you have the opportunity to be in those meetings, that's when you learn from one another. But there's this whole new virtual world that life's different. Whether it will return, who knows?
Well, I think a hybrid model, right? Ideally speaking.
But then
So
what
the
is that
best of
hybrid?
both,
Yeah, yeah. I'm intrigued as to how
what it will
everyone
look like.
uses. Yeah, yeah. And from country to country too, I think is quite interesting. I've heard a few people say that how, you know, in the UK everyone loves to stay at home, whereas in some other countries they're dying to get back to their desks. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And Deborah mentioned in the comments that just going back to the internship idea, she brings up that mentoring support again, even just in
Yeah,
internships, right?
yeah.
Just to make sure that
I honestly cannot endorse mentoring enough. I think mentoring, coaching, it is the best way to have that support, that guidance, that point of reflection, that opportunity to perhaps discuss something out of your peer group, you know. And it's I was very lucky. I had two major mentors throughout my careers to date, and both were very high senior, individuals, and they were able to give me a perspective that I would not have come across on my own from, you know, just chatting to my peers. And I think confidence is always, yeah, always needed.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So let's talk a little bit more, kind of in the vein of what needs to be done to enable working women to succeed and grow their careers into becoming leaders. So anything in particular that you kind of think is very important for that?
I think obviously the first one is hard work. I mean, honestly, you need to be determined, or totally talking from myself and my experience, and I would love to hear yours too. I really feel that, or I constantly say to myself that hard work brings success, and it's tough, especially having a family and, you know, all the other bits and pieces that get thrown in your direction. I think it's hard work to keep striving. And I think one of the main lessons was to establish very early on what success looks like for you, and to continually question where you've got to on those milestones towards that success point. And actually, I learned something. I think Helena, Peter, and Nina, my other colleagues, are on this call, but I've had so much training over my career, and from a fundraising point of view, you're trained in Myers-Briggs. I don't know if you know Myers-Briggs.
Yes.
So I know myself, and I've been trained to identify what other people's Myers-Briggs signs are. And when I first started this training, I'm a very big F. I feel all the way. And I was trained to be a T, to be a thinker, because of course success cannot have any emotion. It should be TTT all the way. And of course, now I realize that that's completely not true. And ultimately, to be successful, you have to be your best self. And it was only when I came to that realization that actually it's totally fine to be a feeler and to think about others all the time. And that took me on the journey to be a great manager. But then I realized that actually I'm not a great manager because my F is too high, and that actually I was much more successful when I stepped away from managing and I became a leader. And it's that difference between managing and lead. I witted a bit there. I hope that made sense. But I think
No, I think it did. Well, I think what's important, right, that you're kind of getting at is that there are certain characteristics that are deemed strong and weak that are sometimes associated with women or men, I think. And that's not necessarily the case, right? You can apply either of those characteristics, whether it's the thinking or the feeling in this particular case, right? You can apply those to be successful, but you just have to allow that authenticity, I think, within your institution and for your team.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think one of the leadership courses that I went on, it was a great week's residency, and ultimately the main lesson was to know your best self and not to worry about your weaknesses, but to really concentrate on where you strive and where you feel that you can grow. And it's almost like you're charting a ship to that point of success. And as long as you stay focused, the rest will part, you know. Yeah.
Definitely. So let's see, thinking about, you know, kind of a little bit more about what can be done, right, to enable women to succeed
Yes.
in the workplace. I think one thing for me that really comes across, and I'm sure you can expand on this, is again from the beginning, kind of identifying as a female leader, right, being able to identify women lower down in the organization who, can be nurtured along the way, just as we would do, kind of in the old
Yeah.
days of
Yeah.
institutions
I
that were
find
mostly men.
I actually, this is a very difficult one for me. I'm dyslexic, and it's been an interesting journey from a dyslexic point of view. And I think that I feel very strongly that all juniors, whether they show potential or not, should be nurtured, because
Of course.
you peak at a different time. And I think that I feel strongly because yes, you don't always show your potential at that given time. And I think that
Mhm.
from that nurturing, from that support, you might then discover actually that person's perfect for that role, or that person's perfect for that experience. I'm not sure if I answered your question very well there. But
No,
I
I
think,
think you did. Well, I think that's a good point too, right? Is that, and I think what I'm saying when I kind of put up that thing about nurturing high potential women, I think it's being able to identify what potential every individual has and to nurture them in
yeah,
in that
right
direction, right?
way.
So not everyone is the same.
And I think that as I mentioned earlier, that difference between potential and performance. And I think ultimately, if performance comes first, it is good, because then people can build their confidence and see the success that they achieve. And from that performance, you can then establish the potential. I think that's right. Please challenge me if you feel differently.
I
It's,
think that's really interesting to look at it that way. Yeah.
yeah. I'm not sure whether it's just purely from my own experience, and that actually I needed to perform in order to build confidence and to challenge myself, because it's that want for challenge that then demonstrates the potential too. Yeah.
Definitely. So let's see. I think the next thing we'll talk about a little bit is how can leaders and managers support their teams? I think we've gone into this quite a bit, but specifically in a way that anyone of any gender can get the resources they need to be able to succeed.
Yeah. So I think it's definitely two things. It's from a manager's point of view, it's carving time to listen, and carving time to prioritize your team. And I
Yeah.
definitely felt in many roles that actually, of course, you're governed by the board, you're governed by delivery, and it's having that reflection to ensure that your team around you. Almost another sort of experience I had was that, or a great book, I'm trying to remember the writer. Anyway, it was about making yourself redundant. And as a manager, that was but that's a really good way of ensuring that your team are actually able to learn from you and to grow and to balance. But to do that, you have to make a different type of success, sacrifice. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, when you're kind of talking about doing that support, I think if you're actually, sorry, I just had this blip in and out. Let's see. That's okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, great. So I think in terms of being able to, have leadership support their teams, it's also about not just kind of after something happens giving
Yeah,
support. I think it's also giving support before. So I think something that's really big in institutions now is giving sort of measurable goals for their team members, right? So that they're not, again, kind of making yourself redundant, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
being able to sort of have that one-on-one time, but also not just having someone kind of be walking blind through their role, but actually saying, okay, this is what we'd like you to achieve. Does this feel reasonable to you? Okay, great. Let's move forward towards that together, rather than just saying, okay, here's your job description, and we're not going to explain anything beyond that for the next 2 years.
and I
You know?
I think coaching is another topic. Obviously, it's very different to mentoring, but coaching is so important, because going back to this Myers-Briggs, everybody needs and requires something very different from their role, and a job description might be very formulaic, but ultimately knowing the person who's delivering that specific role, what their success looks like, how they're going to measure themselves against that. Again, it goes back to having a really robust appraisal system and accountability and transparency, all in an ideal world, of course, which is the challenge, ultimately, having the resources and the time to make it better.
Yeah, so I think, and some of this too, like once you establish these structures or these processes in your team or in your organization, they stick, right? They get embedded into the culture, I think. So it kind of, you only have to set it up once, really, ideally.
Yeah, I think so. But actually, that's also, I do agree, but that pause and reflection to keep up with the way that society is changing is really key. Mm-hmm. I've loved hearing so many organizations recently who are pausing and reflecting and seeing, let's see, actually we ought to do this very differently. How can we make ourselves smaller, but without losing our quality, for example, so that they are more sustainable?
Definitely. Yeah, great. Well, we're going to run into a little bit of Q&A.
Yeah,
but
great.
before we do that, Claire, is there anything coming up for WAF that you would like to share?
I don't think so.
What about the event?
Sorry, what I didn't hear what you said. I thought you were sorry, I missed, I didn't hear your yes. So at WAF we have a very exciting year ahead. So we have our first conference next September in Milan, where we're going to bring everybody together for 2 days.
Beautiful.
Which is really exciting. And then we also have monthly online events, and we'll be launching our hopefully workshop series later as well, bringing people together. Yeah.
Amazing. So we'll definitely include, access to that when we send out all of our information. Yeah. And
I just want to add
to being there.
Yeah, I want to add that our website is a little gem that's yet to be discovered by many, and I want to really push it, because I think if you're looking into art foundations, especially after this call today, we have a fantastic page where you can see over 300 different art foundations, and I think it's a real gem for a voyage of discovery.
I can attest to that. Yes, it's a great resource. Definitely. So let's see, a couple questions we have from Ben. This is a controversial question, I think. So let's see what Claire thinks about it. Because of all of the issues with, mentorship and low salaries and things like that, should we be advising young people not to go into the arts because of it?
No, of course not.
What would you advise them to do if they feel like, a young person goes into the arts and feels like their institution and their manager's not invested in their success or their development?
Okay, so if this goes regardless of wherever anybody works, whatever sector. If you're not happy in your role, then you must find another role where you're happy. I think that happiness definitely strives, enables you to grow and become, further developed. But I think the art world is so enriching. It's such an important, culture to have for everybody. I think when I was at Sotheby's, I realized that perhaps Sotheby's auction houses weren't necessarily for me, but there is a place for everybody everywhere, within the art. There's always somewhere. Have I answered that well enough?
Yeah, and I think also if you are in an institution and in a role that you love, but you feel like you're not being supported, sometimes it's just a matter of asking for it. And I think that can be really scary, right? Especially for young people who are not used to kind of advocating for themselves in a professional environment. But I think you would be surprised how often your manager will be receptive to it, especially if they're managing a lot of people at once. And they may just not realize that you're not getting the attention that you need, right, in order to succeed.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think also it is having that confidence to start that conversation, because I mean, it's a bit of a cliche thing to say, but we all have a piece of paper with our script on. You can't see mine and I can't see yours. Unless you say it, it doesn't, you don't, it's not shared.
Right, definitely. And then I think this is another good question that's come up, which is because, of course, you kind of started your career with the redundancy.
Yes.
So what advice can you have for those, especially in this period, right, where there has been some redundancies around COVID? What would you say to those people, and how can they kind of continue on from that?
Well, I think ultimately, it was a very, very tough time, which is why I said it. It really, it knocks you for six, especially at the beginning of my career. But perseverance, and I think it's here I am, however many years later, and I don't, it hasn't affected me in the slightest. I think confidence that you just have to keep going, and okay, you might have to apply to a few more than you had originally anticipated, but just perseverance. And connections, connections doesn't always relate to having an internship or having the finances to be in a certain situation. It's about really building your peer group around you and finding out about opportunities that you may not have necessarily come across.
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely building a career is different from a job, right?
Yeah,
and requires kind of more of an ecosystem in place. Than just working at a job every day. So yeah, I think that advice is really good. And then what you're talking about with the confidence side of things, I mean, just from my experience, right? I've been in some startups that have failed, right? And obviously haven't continued. And I think partially also knowing when to extricate yourself from your job, like your personal identity, and not having that be synonymous with your work is also important, right? We're really all passionate in the art world about what we do. I think we all know that. But also being able to say, okay, this is not about me, right? Me becoming redundant is not a reflection of who I am.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think also not worrying about, I think, especially in this day and age, if you have got a redundancy on your CV, it really doesn't matter. It's just one of those things. It's still great experience while you're in that post before whatever happened. And everybody knows that it's a global situation. It's not you.
Yeah, I guess that's good advice for managers, right? Is just to make sure that you're not kind of overlooking a candidate because they might have that on their CV.
Never. Yeah,
Definitely.
Great.
Well, I think that was some really amazing, valuable advice and feedback, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us today on ArtEvolve. Yeah, and thank you to everyone else for joining us as well. We'll send out the recording, of course. You can share it along with anyone that you'd like to who couldn't join us today. And we will see you all in a couple weeks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Claire. Have a great evening. Bye.
Take care. Bye.